We are entering the world of Symbaroum again, but this time it is the ruins of Symbaroum, and it is keyed to 5th edition. 5th edition of what? Obviously, 5th edition of this. So Symbaroum has been transported in the ruins of Symbaroum into 5th edition rules. And what I'm going to do in this video, starting with, I think, the player's guide. I've gone back and forth as to which to begin with, but I think I'm going to start with the player's guide, is we're going to take a look through the new material, a flip through here. There's not going to be any gameplay. I'll say what the video is not going to be. The video is not going to have gameplay, nor is the video going to have a specific comparison or explanation of how this material is transported into 5th edition. The books themselves do not contain 5th edition rules. So if you are going to play these, you need to have a basic document of 5th edition rules, either the player's handbook or something you could download from Wizards of the Coast, or even the essential rules here, just the kind of basics that come from, say, for example, the Essentials kit. But what it does contain is information on additional rules and optional rules and changes to rules that they have done for this game. And I'm not going to go through the comparison. I'll mention it because it is mentioned in the books where there is the difference, but I'm not going to go through. This is not going to be a rules analysis, basically. We're looking here at some of the credits in, or the main credits in the Player's Guidebook, and we're not looking in detail at the special thanks, etc. I do thank Free League for sending me physical copies of this material. And as we saw, if you saw my Symbaroum video on playing the main, I should say, I guess, the original edition of Symbaroum, it works very well for solo play. I love the setting, and the setting is a very big part of this game, and indeed the player's handbook begins with details about the setting, much as the original did. And I'm also going to show you a lot of the beautiful art. I should say the other thing I'm not going to do in this video, although I just did, is to go back and compare this to the original game books of this set. We're just going to talk about what is in here. We begin with an explanation of the setting from for the player's perspective, and I'm not going to go into detail about exactly what that setting is beyond saying that the world of this game is very much focused on corruption and evil that happens as nature is invaded and taken over. And you have this forest of Davokar that is a major place where that happens and where a lot of the setting takes place. We have cities here, for example, there's Thistlehold. I think that was part of what my play before in my other video. And you'll see in this book, as well as the GM guide, that there are a lot of explanations about the setting and what happens in those places. There are factions in this world, and the other thing to note about this world is that the elves are a major source of their enemies, basically, in this world. They're not the elves of D&D, and you'll see this when we get to character creation, because you can play an elf, but it is not going to be the kind of elf that you recognize. And I am going to take, as I said, some time to show the very evocative art, because in this world and in this game setting, the art is very significant. So we start out with the world, and we are given even some specific maps here. This is a map of Thistlehold, and it may look familiar to you from my other video. Once we get through the setting, we get to the section on the new rules, and this is going to be where we begin to do character creation, but it's also going to be where you see that you don't necessarily have complete rules here to understand how you're setting up. For example, it doesn't tell you even how to generate the values for your attributes and such. We start out with the role of the player, and we talk about creating both a character goal and a group goal for the game. There is an explanation of rules, new rules here for how you conduct rest. And rest is important in this world because it allows you to remove corruption points that you may be accumulating during the course of the game. And the explanation of what corruption is here is important because essentially the use of magic or the use of magical artifacts will cause characters to gain corruption points, and at a certain point the corruption can become permanent, and if you go beyond the threshold of what your character can handle in terms of corruption, you basically become an NPC. You're overwhelmed by the burdens that you bear in the language of this rule set, and in effect your character doesn't die, but is sort of turned over to the game master as an NPC, and you have to start over. So corruption is a very important mechanic of this game. We move into now seeing what some of the characters that you can play here are. But we start with the abducted humans, and for all of these, we're not going to necessarily take a look at all of them, but we have the traits and suggested names for them, and then various backgrounds that can be chosen during the course of the game. So we also have, for example, we have personality traits that you can choose or roll up, and the ideals and various bonds that you have and flaws that you have to flesh out the character in a somewhat humanistic, well, I shouldn't say humanistic, but to flesh out the character. And for example, here is what a dwarf in Symbaroum looks like, not the typical fantasy dwarf that you know. And there is for these characters, there's a background. I'm not going to get into the details on that, but it will place this character within this world. Some of the characteristics and attributes and traits seem related to what you might think of as a traditional dwarf, yet they are going to be different and fit into this world. You could be a spy or an outcast as a dwarf. You can also play elves, and here's an example of an elf. And again, all of the characters follow somewhat similar with the backgrounds that you're given and various features and characteristics that go along with that. This is what a goblin looks like in this world. And again, history of the character type and backgrounds and traits, etc. Humans is a category that you can play, and I should say that you could, if you wanted to, bring in just a regular D&D sort of character type, but I wouldn't recommend it because I think to experience really this game, it's important to follow along with the character types that are here. And if you're building a human, for example, to use the options of bonds and personality traits and flaws that come from within this rule set, because after all, you are playing this rule set. So that is what is called the origins, basically like the races, but it's called character origins in this game. And then we get to the section on classes and feats. So here you have the section on classes and feats, and it says that they all have special features that allow a unique approach to exploring the setting. Note that our origins and classes are designed to work together. And it says that there's class-specific hit dice information. So, for example, the captain class is a battlefield leader, and we have the class features. And again, this is going to be the same for all of them, what the proficiencies are and what the equipment is. And in this case here, we have the proficiency bonus here, as well as what its features are in terms of what the proficiency bonus will impact. So it's going to impact your approach, your fighting style, and your tactical acumen at level 1, for example, and it's going to be a +2 bonus there. And then during the course of the discussion of this class, you get to the higher levels. So for example, when you reach, here's an example, when you reach 6th level, you invest in your guards and loan them special gear. Each current pupil chooses to gain either a non-magical +1 to weapons attack roll or their armor class total. This bonus cannot be applied to a weapon or armor that already provides a bonus, etc. So it goes through, you have pages for each of the classes. It has different directions that you can take. If, for example, you become an outlaw as a captain at the 3rd level, for example, your base speed is going to increase. It's obviously thematic to being an outlaw. For example, you could be a poet warrior and gain a reflection, which would allow you, when you take a short rest, you can meditate on an enemy that you have fought before. This could be an individual or a specific type of foe. This would give you advantage on attack rolls against that enemy until you miss, after which the effect ends. So they're very, very thematic and quite different within the class. So the poet warrior is going to be quite different than, for example, the outlaw. You could be a hunter. And again, we can see how it follows through with explaining what the proficiency bonus is and what it would impact and the various type of approaches that a hunter could develop into. A bounty hunter is one of them, a witch hunter or a monster hunter. Mystics are going to be magic users and, for example, get a proficiency bonus on spellcasting. And we'll talk about spells in a minute, but they are, as mentioned, corruption comes, one of the ways that corruption happens is through spellcasting. And you have a corruption threshold, which is a proficiency bonus plus your spellcasting ability modifier ×2. So therefore, the higher spellcasting ability you have, the higher your corruption threshold. And the higher your corruption threshold, the more you can take before you have a risk of, well, either needing to rest to lower it or before you have a risk of turning into an NPC, basically. So this is significant, just both mechanically and thematically. Thematically meaning that the world is, that magic is dangerous in the world and it is risky to use magic, and part of the way the game works, we don't have spell slots in this game, but there's the risk of corruption. So in essence, it is that risk of corruption is causing you to think about when you're going to use magic, when you can rest, how you can recover those corruption points, and how risky it is to employ the magic or to, for example, use artifacts, because the use of artifacts also will be risky and perhaps have corruptive power. Within the, we'll just, let's see, go back for a second. Within the mystic, your different approaches are, you could be an artifact crafter is one, and this is going to give you better access to artifacts. You can be self-taught, which is perhaps a little more of a generalist. A sorcerer has various additional ways to do spellcasting with more of a focus on that. Pure symbolism is a tradition that almost solely builds its power on symbols and signs, and it gives you some explanation of what that actually means and then the impact of that and on corruption and spellcasting. And one of the benefits, it lets you make a rune tattoo that protects from weather and wind, like a full set of clothes. And here we go. And scoundrels, which is maybe a bit like a rogue or a thief. Within scoundrel, you could be an explorer or perhaps a former cultist. And in this case, you can see the former cultist. It says you were taught some of the lesser powers of your sorceress master. And so your corruption threshold is slightly different here, and it explains that in detail. So what's great about this is the options. You could be a spy. The options are really, the options for the approach of these classes is really very different from each other and amounts to quite a bit. So looking here at spy, for example, you have a network of contacts that provides you with information, and it will explain what that exactly means and how you can get benefits from meeting with a person. And Treasure Hunter gives you some proficiency, if you want it, with alchemist supplies, for example, at level 3 to produce elixirs, to identify drugs and poisons, a nimbleness benefit. Of course, there's going to be a warrior class, and warriors could be berserkers or duelists or knights. So this is some ways that various things that may be familiar from D&D are put in here in slightly different ways. So in the end, just looking back, this is back to the table of contents. You can see here, looking down the table of contents, just how many different options there are. I haven't counted all of these up, but really quite a bit. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Within the 5 types of classes, there are so many different directions to go, and you combine that with the various origins here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 origins, 5 classes, and then different approaches within that. Just a ton of variety. Then we get to the feats, and this feat represents a talent or area of expertise that gives the character special capabilities. It embodies training, experience, and abilities beyond what the class provides. And there are boons as well as burdens. So it says these are role-playing hooks, and many of them provide a bonus to an ability. So we're not going to take a look at these, but here we can see just the list here of what the boons are. We have an archivist, a green thumb, a pathfinder, contacts, escape artist, false identity, a storyteller. Let's just take a look, for example. What does storyteller give us? Gives a +1 to charisma. You are a gifted storyteller, and no matter if you narrate legends, religious myths, or burlesque tales, you will impress the audience. You gain advantage on charisma, deception, or performance checks when attempting to weave a credible story to impress your listeners, and you are skilled enough to earn an income from your performances, and then it refers you to the downtime rules. So that's an example here. And then we get to the burdens. Burdens are the negative traits which add to the character's history and also provide opportunities to earn inspiration by using the negative effects in a game. And we have a list of all of them here. Addiction, arch enemy, seizures, nightmares, impulsive, dark secret, dark blood. Let's look up what dark secret would mean. Oh, it's also a bonus to charisma here. You have some kind of dark secret which threatens to destroy your reputation and life if revealed. Once per adventure, there is a risk that the secret will be exposed. You have to make a DC 10 ability check with the ability chosen based on the circumstances. If failed, someone discovers a clue which can lead to the truth. Maybe some kind of physical evidence surfaces or whatever. Okay, so that's that. The section on resources is somewhat what you would expect here. So we have equipment. There are equipment packs that you could opt to purchase at the outset. All going to be somewhat familiar. Artifacts, and this is where, again, not going to get into the rules too much, but artifacts do come with, some of them come with corruption, that they, permanent or temporary corruption that will come along with them if you try to use them. And then we get to the listing of spells. Again, not going to go through this in detail because many of these are going to be familiar in terms of the content, in terms of the use here, and the corruption within the rule set. That will be different. Different types of origins have different spells. So for example, the witch is listed here, the troll singer. Cantrips do not provide any corruption. Those come corruption free, I'm pretty sure. There's the wizard spells, and then we have the spell description here in alphabetical order. And it does say here that some are new and some are modified, and they're just in alphabetical order. And for the ones that do have corruption points, it will tell you what those are, I believe. And then there is a little note here that The names of some original game license spells, some D&D spells, appear a little different in this listing than other products. In short, we can't use anyone's name, so if the spell is named after its famous inventor, the name is left off or changed up. Otherwise, the spell remains the same. So they sort of a copyright trademark type of notice there for that. And I believe that is the end. Oh, we have, let's see. Yep. And then we have the, and then we end with an index and a list of the Kickstarter backers at the end. And we have some character sheets here that obviously nobody's going to write in the book, but you can see what the character sheet is. So that's a flip through of the player's guide for the Ruins of Symbaroum. Next, we're going to take a look at the Game Master's Guide, and we can see from the table of contents here that there is really quite a lot of information devoted to the setting, as you would expect, as well as the general information about creating setting adventures and setting adventure design, and not too many random tables for setting this up. There are some, and we'll take a look at them, but a lot of this book is very narrative focused, and I would imagine that this is something that GMs would want to read and familiarize themselves with a lot before sessions start. Again, there's not specific rules in here. All the rules that you might need to understand the 5e system are not in here. They will call out specifics as they relate to changes in Symbaroum. As you would expect, there's very general information at the outset about running games and involving players and different ways to start games or sessions, and a very brief overview of difficulty classes, ability checks, and saving throws, and which attributes you would use to conduct those, but nothing in particular detail about the rule system itself. There's a table here that is great on difficulty class ranges, and it will tell you the level range of your player, and if you want the success to be, say, 90%, this would be the DC. Now, arguably, you wouldn't even have somebody roll for this, but I suppose if you really wanted to, you could. And 75, 50, 25, 10. I think this is pretty useful and could be ported to other games, of course. There's also a discussion on combat and challenge ratings, and so you can see here, for example, an indication of how the rules are here. It says, for familiarity's sake, all the core rules, meaning D&D, for combat apply. And it then explains some information about different types of possible challenges that a GM could make. And this will be, again, especially good for new GMs to understand that combat doesn't have to be the only type of challenge that happens in a session, and it walks you through what those other things could be. Discussion about time. We mentioned here in the section on the player's manual that this concept of corruption and the role of shadows and the power of corruption in this game is very important, and there's a further discussion of it here. It also references you back to the player's handbook. So you can see this is typical of the way these are designed, with a double-page spread of lovely art at the opening of the sections, and this really does evoke the game world quite nicely. A very detailed and lengthy section here, multiple 20, 30 pages here on the world, and we're not going to go through it, but it gives you the major areas or the cities in the world and areas and locations within that, and a description of those. So to set up a party somewhere as a base or as a destination, you'll have enough that you can build off of in your mind and imagination to develop it. They're also giving you some NPCs and persons of interest, and this is all, for example, in just Thistlehold, and then areas of conflict. So there's really quite a bit of development for some of these sections in the world. And we're not going to go through all this, but I will pause to show, again, some of the art is, I think all of the art is beautiful, but I paused to show you some of the art. So for example, if you wanted to start someone out at the cargo docks, you would have pretty little, three detailed paragraphs there about that, and some NPCs, etc. And when we get to the section on, so as you can see, there are no random tables here. But when we get to this section here on under, above, and beyond, this is talking about if the realm of Ambria and Devakar are not enough, then you may enter other areas, like, for example, an underworld. And the underworld is a vast system of caves, chambers, tunnels, and crevasses that extends beneath the roots, fields, and cobblestones of the game world. And it talks here about, again, some kind of evocative description of the nature, the cultures, and creatures that may be there. And we're going to look at the Bestiary or the Bestiary. I never know how to pronounce that in the third section of this video. And it does say that you will see there some numbers of creatures that are described as residents of the underworld. And of course, it says you can fiddle with already existing creatures to make them work in this setting. And it even gives you an adventure setup that could work here. An expedition sent by Ordo Magica, the Sun Church, or some similar faction has gone missing, and then people are going to try to find them. Here is a nice D20 table with some subsections, some kind of D6 subsections within it of events that could happen in the underworld. And this is something that you could use in other types of rule sets. So you have a monster encounter, you have a collapsed ruin, you find the source of some type of corruption. Of course, corruption per se is tied to these rules, but you could abstract that into something else. A rune-covered gate, for example. And we also have the Yonder World here, and it says the Yonder World has already been hinted at, and we're uncertain about it as is Ambria's intellectual elite. And especially when it comes to the most contentious issue, whether it consists of a single world or multiple ones. And then you get an indication of exactly what this place is with some very suggestive art here, and another adventure setup to play out in the underworld. And again, another D20 table with some D6 subheads in it. So somebody might discover the great throne of a demon prince alone in the desert, or pointy rooftops of copper protrude from the ground, and then a description. So this is a great table. Again, I could see using this very easily with another rule set. And finally, we have the spirit world here. And it says whether or not the spirit world can be visited is for the GM to decide. And we see, again, familiar, the history, the nature, an adventure setup, and a nice table of, this is a D10 table of possible events that could happen in the spirit world. Section 3, expeditions in Davakar. This section is going to describe in general detail frameworks for types of missions that could happen. So there could be a treasure hunt, doing missionary work, a manhunt. Talks about how to move through the world, and we'll see here this is the map, the familiar map from the player's guide, but we have here a hex grid placed over it, and it is divided into sections. Here there's bright Davakar, wild Davakar, and dark Davakar. It's a little hard to differentiate some of these. I think this is the bright here, wild, and the dark. And it would be up to you as the GM to decide where exactly somebody was in there, because it's not like there's a ton of cities in the forest. It comes into play because there are some tables here that will tell you various things that happen based on where you are, dark, wild, or bright. And it starts out with a table or a list here of things that misfortunes that could happen in the wilderness. And again, this is Probably something that could be ported into some other wilderness adventure if you wanted to. You roll a 1d20 and you modify it by +5 if you are in wild Davokar, or +10 if you reach the dark. So it gets more deadly, I suppose, as you go up in value on the table. There could be a wildfire, thorns, a distant howl. So we start out with something relatively innocuous, maybe bad omen, up all the way up to we get to corrupted soil, and here the heart of darkness is at 29, and the eye of the forest. You have information here if you want to, as the GM, do all of these things for your players, to have them get a map and information from other people and hire a guide or other companions that could possibly be hired. There's a note here at the bottom that points out that while companions can be used as additional player characters, we recommend that they are treated fundamentally as NPCs. This means they don't make death saving throws, but instead die at 0 hit points. So a little differentiation there from a regular character. Here we have a whole section, another whole section on events, with the information here that if we're in wild Davokar, we add +2 to the rolls on the tables. Dark adds +5. And if you're traveling along a waterway, you add +2 to the enemy roll here. And we have categories of events that could happen in ruins, general encounters, enemies that could be had, and as the GM or the solo GM, you could put this together quite nicely to create a pretty easy creation of a travel kind of scenario. There are terrain effects. We have here treasures of the ruins and seeking out treasure in the forest, and investigating the ruins is a big part of this game. There is a D20 table here that is by treasure type, and this is also broken down into, depending on where you are in the world, bright, wild, or dark, how deeply you've gone into the forest. It will indicate, based on your role, are you going to be then finding debris, a curiosity, mystical treasure, or artifact. And you get the ensuing tables to roll on. This is the curiosities, this is a D100 table, and you have a mystical treasure table and the artifacts, and the artifacts are described on the later pages here of the book. So pretty easily worked out. Whole section here on ruin details, and again, this is something that could probably be ported into other games with modifications, obviously, for the specific rules, but we have a table here for the function, the original purpose of the ruin, their features, who might be living there, the traits of those people, their relationships, how you get to other levels in the ruin. It's possible that as a GM, your player group might want to establish an outpost, or military conquest, a holy mission, a monster hunt, or staging an expedition. So this is going to explain how you can, as the GM, help players do things like claim a land, construct an outpost, do harvesting, perhaps do trade and vending, and how that outpost could expand over time. It also talks further about having bigger other types of missions, like this is a holy mission here, and it has some specific events that could happen during that. The monster hunt is one that was mentioned. The wilderness must be tamed, if not outright beaten into submission. One way of demonstrating the superiority and dominance of the Ambrian people is through monster trophies, and it takes you through thinking about how the characters, for example, might decide on what their prey is, what kind of tools that they would need to bring to effect a successful monster hunt, collecting the trophies, doing the hunt, and there's a table to let you figure out what the challenge rating of something could be, and ultimately, if it was in good condition or bad condition, the value that it would have. There is the next section, section 4, is called Setting and Adventure Design. And this is interesting because it's one of few GM guides I can think of that makes reference to both other games that these people who've created this rule set have written, and actually other books. There's a little aside at some point referring readers to a French philosopher if they want to gain more information about this type of presentation of story. Could be useful to any GM anywhere. Again, this is, as you can see, extremely narrative. It's not something that it's really deep into GM prep if somebody was going to be using this, talking about the primary building blocks of story, how to have a main conflict, the tone, what secondary building blocks mean. Here's that section on further reading that I mentioned. I haven't really seen anything like this before in a book, and as I said, at parts here I can't really pick them out immediately, but there are other sections here where they refer to other rule sets that they've written and how this one is kind of similar or different to them. A kind of meta discussion about what the process of creating a game world is or should be for GMs. Another discussion at the tropes and structures of things, what they're calling a classic adventure, and they break it down into the intrigue, the mission, the antagonists, other agents, environments, different aspects of the landscape or scenes, and how you can structure sessions and what types of positive or negative incentives there can be for the characters, how you design a landscape. So a lot of very useful information about the structure of an actual session. What's particularly, I think, novel here and useful is that this book contains a sample adventure called Blight Night. And in the section here on designing a landscape and designing a session, they will talk about, for example, what type of plots that a landscape could be involved in. And then they will give an example from the very adventure that's in the back of the book. So in this case, they're talking about when working up an adventure landscape, the first question is, of course, what the landscape should be about and how you can think about that and link it to conflicts and things like that. And then it will give the example. The plot of the adventure Blight Night is directly linked to the struggle between civilization and nature. It is about blah, 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 and it goes on. And you can actually, you have that very adventure here at the back of this book. That is the Blight Night adventures somewhere here. Here it is, section 6. So you can read through this scenario, and it says this scenario is intended to function as an example of how a small adventure landscapes can be designed following the guidelines presented on page 108. And then it says, of course, it is also an adventure landscape that can be played, etc. So it is showing you, it's not only just really telling you what the concepts, the larger concepts are, but it is showing you how they enact them in the adventure that they provide. And it goes through that. And that, I think, is extremely useful. And in fact, for a beginning GM, for example, that might be the first thing you would want to turn to here in this book if you were starting to run a table with this game and you hadn't done that before. The next section is on something called Chronicles, and Chronicles basically are a series of adventures or a campaign, and it talks about how you would write those up, how you would have things like, for example, recurring roles in that. Maybe the game world would change slightly, and some basically campaign advice here, talking about the difference between the first adventure and the course of the chronicle as it goes, and the ultimate end of the chronicle, if it's going to have an end, and what that might mean. There's a section here on the rewards and magical treasures and artifacts. We talked about the fact that artifacts have corruption attached to them and magical treasures. There's a listing here of OGL, original game license, magic items, and there's a comment here that basically not all of the magic items provided in the core rules, meaning of D&D, fit within the setting of the runes and the ruins of Symbaroum. So they've included a list of ones that they think do, and you would need to sort of refer back to your own D&D materials to know exactly, for example, what the bag of beans might do. And there it is also linking them to Symbaroum rules with the corruption and the type it is and the rarity, which will help you figure out if somebody's using, for example, the gauntlets of ogre power, what type of corruption that deals out. There is the artifacts have been referred to before, and again, these do come with corruption. These are magical and powerful items and things that can be found in the world, and there are a listing of them here, as well as what's really interesting and useful is ways to link them into an adventure. So they have a little section here on adventure setup and how you could perhaps put this particular artifact, this rare or very rare artifact, into a story and how it would make sense in a type of a story. And I don't know if it looks like this is for all of them actually. So I think this is, to take the extra effort to do that rather than just have a listing of these, I think makes this very useful for GMs who want to establish whether it's a one session or part of a session or part of a larger campaign or chronicle based around an artifact. It will give you an example. So for example, there are several variants of adventures that might include the mirror. This is a legendary type of mirror that lets you see into this yonder world perhaps and gain information. And the other side can also look back, and it does give you corruption, as is indicated here. And it will explain some type of adventure. In fact, 3 variants that you could create as to somebody has it and is trying to influence where the PCs are, for example, or somebody doesn't have it and wants to go back to get it, or whatever. So a little bit of suggestion for the GM to play out or to develop a story and a framework around that. Section 5 talks about optional and new rules that come with this game, including having traps as bigger challenges, including what the mechanism of that might be and a solution to that. There are rules for having ceremonies here. This is what the ceremonial focus might be, the time frame of it, and the procedure for having rituals and sacrifices and mystical ceremonies and side effects from ceremonies. A whole series of rules here on chase. If you want to chase, whether it is an NPC or an enemy, and a monster enemy, what the range of the chase is, what what obstacles could be, what types of, and there's some tables here for common obstacles or obstacles in cities and farmlands. They're oddly a little short. They're basically like D4 tables. So it seems to me, well, the common obstacle table is a D8 table, but the city and farmland and the bright and dark Davokar obstacles are D4 tables, which seems a little odd to me. Maybe they just sort of ran out of time there to make a longer table, but tables are always great. There is a discussion here on domains. It says, why should player characters always have to run around searching for adventure when adventure is just as likely to come to them? This chapter introduces rules and guidelines for owning and managing an area of land, complete with buildings and inhabitants. So if you were GMing and wanted to have a player party living somewhere and developing it, you could have some rules for that. They give some examples of some types of domains: a fortified farm, a normal village or a remote village, a trading post perhaps, a market town, and it will give, again, there's a D20 table of some major events that could happen, and what will happen if this is under attack. There's a section on pact making. To enter into a pact with one of the ancient powers of the world can be a shortcut to knowledge and power, but it is far from risk-free. And it talks about making a pact and how that would start, what the benefits and cost of said pact might be. Just, again, other options that could be brought into your story. And then there's a summary here. The people, the following rundown of the various social groups that characterize the region, has no rules implications, but may be useful to GMs when describing individuals the characters see or to come into contact with. So this is, again, just providing more narrative background for the GM to really understand and flesh out the world of this rule set. There are rules if you're trying to do large-scale wars or battles and dealing with armies and the course of a battle, and what to do if you're making a PC as a commander of the battle. And there's even a D20 table to have a type of misfortune that would occur to an entire army, like encountering diseased water or some form of sabotage. And then the book does end up with the scenario that I mentioned earlier that is referenced in the world building section. And I won't page through this, but it is a beginning scenario that says it's intended to function, as we said, as an example of how a small adventure landscape in this world would work. So you can see that the Game Master's Guide is very, very narrative focused, and it does provide a lot of large scale framework for creating stories in an RPG setting. In this case, it's Symbaroum, but really the advice is useful, I think, for any type of GM using any type of rules. And finally, we're going to take a look at the Bestiary or the Bestiary that is with this rule set. It is gorgeously illustrated and is divided into various sections. There's various types of beasts and monsters in this world: abominations, amphibians and aquatics, flora, herbivores, predators, spiders, undead, winged creatures, and various types of adversaries that are in the world, including elves and ogres and outsiders and others. There are discussion here of various monster features. We'll see a listing in the back of those, and terrain features, and it is broken down into different sections. They're presented in different ways, and it opens up with the listing of monsters alphabetically. The font here is a little hard to read, I'll say, if you're not familiar with this word, Arak, for example, and it will give you stat blocks for them, and it will give you their special things that they can do, actions that they can take, and of course a piece of art associated with this. And this section is all alphabetical and follows this format. It will also give, again, some adventure setups that could involve any of these types of creatures and backgrounds and traits and things. If you wanted to play that creature, I guess, is what that is. You could, this is a type of fighter. So there's a whole section here on playing that creature. We're not going to look through all of this, the colossi, just to give you a sense of the art, and the presentation is lovely. These books are all beautifully illustrated and as physical objects, very, very well put together with ribbons and solid bindings and glossy paper that's pretty thick and opaque. That's a Darkling Hunter. Look at the Death Prince here. Again, adventure setups for the Death Prince. All the stat block for the Death Prince Here is going to look at a dragon. There is a glimmer that is a medium undead that you could encounter. So then in the next section of the book, so there's quite a lot of that. Here's we're going to end with this world serpent. That's just, it's pretty scary. What would happen if the world serpent itself actually existed and came back to life is too horrible to even imagine. Indeed, looks pretty horrible. Then we have a section that's called Beasts and Monsters, and these are categorized in the way that I mentioned earlier. Like it starts with the abominations and gives you a shorter description, but sort of more of them, I guess, is the way to say it. And lots of stat blocks here. Then we have amphibians and aquatics. Some great art still, just not necessarily on every page. The flora, that Davikar's vegetation is dangerous is well known to all. Of course, that is a theme in this game, that the wilderness is dangerous and angry, basically. Then we have the section on adversaries. These are more sort of, I would, for lack of a better word, say humanoid adversaries that you could encounter, and NPCs that you could fight or perhaps try to reason with. The Templar is one. Elves, as mentioned earlier, are going to be, while you can play an elf, elves in this world are adversarial toward people. And so there are different types of elves. There's the elf of spring, summer, late summer, and autumn. I think if you're playing an elf, you would be playing the elf of spring, I think. I skipped over that in the player guide. And then the final section, and we also have trolls here. We'll take a look at this troll. The final section here is on adaptation and expansion. And it talks about, it will give again, a description of the categories here. I'm not sure why this is at the back, but we did review it earlier, that says the monsters use a slightly different system of categorization from the core system. Abominations, beasts, constructs, dragons, elementals, etc. explains this. And then there is an alphabetical listing of attributes. The following provides a list of monster features, traits. You can use this list to help customize an OGL creature, a D&D creature, to create a new one or to modify an existing threat to make a new challenge for your players. I really like this. I wish it were I wish it were numbered, so one could just roll some dice and easily create just three random things and make up a creature from that. But of course you could hand number it if you wanted to that way and do that yourself. There's also a listing here of things that might happen if you find the creature's lair. Could have cold air or collapse or have strange vapors or unstable ground, and it explains what these things are here and different actions and reactions that monsters could have and what swarms might do. Terrain features will be discussed here in terms of what could happen in various terrains and how that might impact combat or the encounter. What will happen in a forest as opposed to mountains could have boulders, for example. Ruins could have old and unstable walls. And then there is, at the very end here, using other resources, it explains the difference between the 5e stat blocks and the Ruins of Symbaroum stat blocks here. It also talks about the original Symbaroum and a way to convert the original Symbaroum that isn't mentioned in here into this 5e setting. And there's also a list here of recommended OGL monsters that aren't in here that could be easily converted to this system. And then a index that will give you stat blocks alphabetically by challenge rating. So it will list all the challenge rating 1 monsters, 2, 3. This is really extremely useful. And then the type of, the abominations, the beasts, the constructs. And that's it, the OGL at the end. So that is a look inside this bestiary. I think for solo play, one would probably want to go right to the end here and look at the stat blocks by challenge rating to, if you're looking to get a lower challenge encounter, if you're running a party with like one PC or one or two PCs, you'd be looking possibly there. And that could be really useful to create a random table with, for example, as an encounter table for you. So Symbaroum has come to 5e, and this is a look inside the 3 books of material for that. And again, to say that you'll need to have some reference to the original 5e rules to get the ins and outs of how this will actually work, but to play in this world, to live in this world, and use the rules of 5th edition, this is all you need to do that.